Lanterns on the River. Chapter 1. The Tradition. In the small village of Saint-Luce, nestled between green hills and quiet fields, there was a river that curved like a ribbon through the land. It was not a wide river, but it was deep and slow, and the people who lived near it treated it with quiet respect. They called it La Rêveuse, the dreamer, because it moved gently, as if lost in thought. Every spring, when the trees began to bloom and the air smelled of wet earth and flowers, the villagers prepared for the lantern night. It was the most important evening of the year, though it was not loud or grand. There were no fireworks, no music, no speeches. It was a night of silence, of light, and of letting go. Each family made their own lantern. They used thin paper, small candles, and pieces of wood to build a floating base. Some lanterns were simple, others were decorated with drawings or words. But all of them carried something invisible inside, a secret, a regret, or a feeling that had never been spoken aloud. People wrote these thoughts on slips of paper and placed them inside the lanterns. Then, at sunset, they walked to the river together. The villagers did not talk much during the walk. Children held their parents' hands. Older people moved slowly, holding their lanterns close. When they reached the riverbank, they stood in a long line and waited for the signal. At the first star in the sky, someone rang a small bell. One by one, the villagers placed their lanterns on the water and watched them float away. The river carried the lights gently downstream. The lanterns moved like stars on the surface, glowing softly in the dark. Some flickered and went out quickly. Others floated far into the night. No one followed them. No one tried to catch them. That was part of the tradition. Once the lantern left your hands, it was no longer yours. It belonged to the river. People believed that the river took their pain and carried it away. They believed that the lanterns helped them let go of things they could not say out loud. Some released sorrow. Some released guilt. Some released love that had never been returned. The river accepted everything without question. Théo Lambert had grown up with this tradition. He had watched the lanterns every year since he was a child. At first, he had thought they were just pretty lights. But as he grew older, he began to understand their meaning. He saw how his mother's face changed after she let go of her lantern. He saw how neighbors stood a little straighter the next day, as if a weight had been lifted. Théo was 17 now, and this year, he planned to make his own lantern for the first time. He had something to release, something he had kept inside for many years. He didn't know if the river would understand, but he hoped it would listen. The people of Saint-Luce never asked where the lanterns went. They didn't need to know. It was enough to believe that the river carried them somewhere. Somewhere far, somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. And so, year after year, the tradition continued. The lanterns floated into the night, carrying the silent voices of the village. And the river, always calm, always dreaming, carried them away. Chapter 2. Downstream. Valmont was a quiet city with old stone buildings, narrow streets, and a river that moved slowly through its center. The river was calm most of the year, but every spring it seemed to carry something more than water. Juliette had lived in Valmont for many years. She worked at the public library, a small building with tall windows and shelves full of forgotten books. She liked silence, order, and the smell of paper. Her life was simple, and she preferred it that way. Juliette was 39 years old. She had lost her husband in a car accident 7 years earlier. Since then, she had lived alone in a small apartment above a bakery. She didn't speak much to her neighbors, but she was kind and polite. People in Valmont knew her as quiet and thoughtful. She spent her days helping visitors find books, organizing old records, and reading in the evenings. She didn't believe in magic, but she believed in patterns. And one spring, she noticed a pattern she couldn't explain. It started with a dream. She saw a woman standing by a river, holding a lantern made of paper and wood. The woman looked sad but peaceful. Juliette didn't know her, but the feeling stayed with her all day. The next year, after the same week in spring, another dream came. This time, it was a child sitting on a bridge, whispering something to the water. Again, Juliette woke up with a strange feeling, as if she had lived someone else's memory. At first, she thought it was stress. Spring was always busy at the library, with students preparing for exams and tourists asking for maps. She told herself the dreams were just her mind trying to rest. But each year, the dreams returned. They became clearer, stronger, and more emotional. She began to feel sadness that wasn't hers. She remembered places she had never visited. She felt the weight of regrets she didn't understand. Juliette started writing down the dreams. She kept a notebook beside her bed and recorded every detail she could remember. The colors, the faces, the words. She noticed that the dreams always came after the same night, the night when the river seemed to glow with small lights. She didn't know where the lights came from, but she saw them from her window, floating gently downstream. She asked around, but no one in Valmont knew much about the lights. Some said they came from a village upstream. Others thought they were part of a festival. No one seemed curious. But Juliette couldn't ignore them. She felt a connection, something deep and quiet. She began to research the villages along the river. She looked at maps, read local histories, and searched for traditions. One name kept appearing, Saint-Luce. It was a small village, not far from Valmont, known for its peaceful nature and old customs. Juliette found a short article in an old magazine that mentioned a spring ritual involving lanterns. People in Saint-Luce released floating lights into the river, each carrying a personal message. The article didn't say much, but it was enough. Juliette felt something click inside her. She didn't know why the lanterns affected her. She didn't know how dreams could travel with the river. But she believed there was a reason. She believed that the emotions she felt were real, even if they didn't belong to her. She believed that the river carried more than water, it carried memory. Juliette continued writing. She began to collect stories from others in Valmont. She asked quiet questions, listened carefully, and found that she was not alone. Some people had also felt strange dreams, sudden sadness, or moments of reflection they couldn't explain. They didn't talk about it, but they remembered. The river had become something more. It was no longer just part of the landscape. It was a messenger, a thread between lives. Juliette didn't understand it fully, but she was ready to learn. She knew that something was waiting to be discovered. And she knew that the answers were not in books, but in the quiet flow of water and light. So she kept watching the river. She kept writing. And she waited for the next spring, when the lanterns would return, carrying secrets downstream. Chapter 3. Théo's Lantern. Théo Lambert had always felt different from the other boys in Saint-Luce. He was quiet, thoughtful, and often lost in his own world. While others played football or rode bikes through the village, Théo spent hours sketching in his notebook or walking along the riverbank. He liked the sound of water, the way it moved without hurry. He liked how the river seemed to carry secrets, just like him. Théo lived with his mother, Camille, in a small stone house near the edge of the village. She worked as a seamstress and often hummed while she sewed. She was kind and gentle, but she didn't talk much about the past. Théo had learned not to ask. There was one question he had never voiced, one name he had never spoken. His father. All Théo knew was that his father had left before he was born. His mother never explained why. She kept a small box in her closet, and Théo had opened it once when he was 10. Inside was a letter, yellowed with time, written in a careful hand. It was signed by a man named Luke. The letter didn't say much, only that he was sorry and that he hoped one day Théo would understand. Théo had read it many times over the years, always in secret. He had memorized every word, but he never showed it to anyone. This year, Théo decided to make his own lantern. He had watched the ceremony every spring, standing quietly among the crowd. He had seen how people placed their regrets and secrets into the river, hoping to be free. He had never joined them. But now, something inside him said it was time. He built the lantern slowly, using thin wood and soft paper. He painted a small blue star on the side, a symbol he had always drawn when he felt alone. Inside, he placed the letter. He folded it carefully and tucked it into the base of the lantern. He didn't write anything new. The letter was enough. It held everything he had never said. On the night of the ceremony, Théo walked to the river with the others. The sky was clear and the stars were bright. People stood in silence, holding their lanterns close. When the bell rang, they began to release them one by one. Théo waited until most had gone. Then he stepped forward and placed his lantern on the water. He watched it float away, the candle flickering gently. He felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. The letter was no longer hidden. It was part of the river now. He didn't know where it would go, but he hoped it would be seen. He hoped someone, somewhere, would understand. That night, in the city of Valmont, Juliette Morin had a dream. She saw a boy standing by the river, holding a letter. His face was calm, but his eyes were full of questions. He placed the letter into a small lantern and watched it drift away. Juliette woke with a deep feeling in her chest. She didn't know the boy, but she felt his pain. She felt his hope. And she knew she had to find him. Théo returned home and sat by his window. He didn't speak to his mother. He didn't write in his notebook. He just watched the stars and listened to the river. Something had changed. He had let go of the secret, but he didn't feel empty. He felt open. He felt ready. The river moved quietly through the night, carrying the lantern downstream. It passed trees, stones, and sleeping villages. It carried the letter, the memory, and the silent wish of a boy who had never known his father. And somewhere far away, someone had heard. Chapter 4. The Search. Juliette Morin had never been the kind of person who followed dreams. She believed in books, in facts, in quiet routines. But the dream of the boy by the river had stayed with her. It was not just a picture in her mind. It was a feeling in her chest, something deep and persistent. She could not explain it, but she knew it was real. She felt that someone had reached out to her, and she could not ignore it. She began her search with maps. At the library, she studied the river's path, tracing its flow from the hills to the sea. She marked the villages along the way, looking for clues. She asked questions, gently and politely, to people who came in for books. Some had heard of the lantern tradition. A few remembered seeing lights on the water. Most didn't know much. But Juliette kept asking. She took short trips on weekends, visiting the villages one by one. She walked along riverbanks, watched the water, and spoke to locals. She didn't mention the dream at first. She asked about the lanterns, about spring rituals, about old customs. In one village, she met a baker who said his grandmother used to release a lantern every year. In another, a teacher told her about a place called Saint-Luce, where the tradition was still strong. Saint-Luce was small and quiet, surrounded by trees and fields. The river there was wide and slow, with smooth stones along the edge. Juliette arrived in the early afternoon, carrying a notebook and a calm smile. She walked through the village, observing the houses, the gardens, the people. She saw children playing near the water and old men sitting outside the cafe. Everything felt peaceful, but she sensed something more. At the local shop, she asked about the lanterns. The shopkeeper nodded and said it was a tradition they had kept for generations. Every spring, the villagers made lanterns and released them into the river. Each lantern carried a message, a secret or a sorrow. Juliette listened carefully. She asked if anyone had made a lantern recently that seemed different. The shopkeeper thought for a moment, then mentioned a boy named Théo. Théo Lambert lived with his mother near the edge of the village. He was quiet, kind, and often seen walking alone by the river. He had made a lantern this year, the shopkeeper said, and had released it late in the evening, after most people had gone home. Juliette felt a chill. She didn't know Théo, but the name felt familiar. She thanked the shopkeeper and walked toward the house. She didn't knock. She didn't want to disturb anyone. Instead, she sat on a bench near the river and waited. She watched the water, listened to the birds, and thought about the dream. She remembered the boy's face, the letter in his hand, the way he had looked at the lantern before letting it go. She didn't know how she had seen it, but she knew it was real. As the sun began to set, she saw a figure walking along the riverbank. It was a boy, tall and thin, with dark hair and a thoughtful expression. He moved slowly, as if lost in thought. Juliette watched him from a distance. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just observed. She felt something shift inside her. She didn't need proof. She didn't need answers. She knew this was the boy from her dream. She didn't know why the river had brought his message to her, but she believed it had. She believed that some feelings were strong enough to travel through water, through silence, through sleep. Juliette didn't approach Théo that day. She wanted to respect his space. But she knew she would return. She knew she needed to speak to him, to understand his story, to share her own. She felt that their lives had touched, even if only for a moment. And she believed that the river had chosen her for a reason. The search had led her to Saint-Luce, to the boy, to the truth behind the lantern. And now, Juliette Morin was ready to listen. Chapter 5. The Meeting. The next morning, Juliette returned to the river in Saint-Luce. The air was cool, and the sky was pale with early light. She walked slowly along the path, listening to the soft sounds of water and birds. The village was quiet. Most people were still inside their homes. She carried no plan, no script. She only hoped to see the boy again, the one she believed had sent her the dream. Théo Lambert had come to the river too. He often did, especially after releasing his lantern. The river helped him think. It helped him feel less alone. That morning, he sat on a flat stone near the edge, watching the water move. He didn't expect anyone to join him. He liked the silence. But when he saw Juliette walking toward him, something inside him shifted. She didn't speak right away. She sat a few steps away, close enough to be near, but not too close. Théo looked at her, curious but calm. He didn't know who she was, but he didn't feel afraid. There was something gentle in her face, something familiar. Juliette looked at him and saw the boy from her dream. The same quiet eyes, the same thoughtful posture. She felt sure it was him. They sat together for a while, saying nothing. The river moved between them, soft and steady. Juliette finally spoke, not with questions, but with a story. She told him about her dreams, how they came every spring, how they felt like memories that didn't belong to her. She described the last dream, the boy with the letter, the lantern floating away. She didn't say she was certain it was him. She simply shared what she had seen. Théo listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. As she spoke, he felt something open inside him. He had never told anyone about the letter, not even his mother. He had kept it hidden for years, afraid of what it meant. But now, hearing Juliette's words, he realized the lantern had truly reached someone. His secret had traveled with the river. His pain had been felt. He didn't explain everything. He didn't need to. Juliette didn't ask for details. She didn't push. She just sat with him, letting the silence speak. Théo felt lighter. Not because the pain was gone, but because it was no longer his alone. Someone had heard it. Someone had understood. Juliette saw the change in his eyes. She saw how the weight had shifted. She didn't know why the river had chosen her, but she was grateful. She felt that her own quiet life had found a new purpose. She had always listened to books, to stories, to silence. Now she had listened to a soul. They stayed by the river until the sun rose higher. Then Juliette stood and nodded gently. Théo nodded back. No promises were made. No plans were set. But something had passed between them, something real and quiet. Juliette walked back through the village, feeling calm. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew the meeting had mattered. She had followed a dream, and it had led her to truth. Théo stayed by the water a little longer. He looked at the river and thought about the lantern. He thought about the letter, about his father, about the woman who had seen his pain. He didn't feel lost anymore. He felt seen. And as the river flowed on, carrying light and memory, both Juliette and Théo carried something new inside them. A connection. A beginning. A quiet change. Chapter 6. A wave of change. Juliette Morin returned to Valmont with a quiet sense of purpose. Her meeting with Théo had changed something inside her. She no longer felt confused by the dreams or afraid of the emotions they carried. Instead, she felt curious. She wanted to understand more. She wanted to know if others had felt the same strange pull from the river. She began by speaking to people she trusted. At the library, she asked regular visitors if they had ever experienced unusual dreams or feelings during spring. She didn't mention lanterns at first. She simply asked if they had ever felt sadness that didn't belong to them, or remembered something they had never lived. To her surprise, some nodded slowly. They didn't have clear answers, but they had felt something. One woman said she often dreamed of walking through a forest she had never seen. A man described a memory of a child's voice calling from the river, though he had no children. Another person said she cried every spring without knowing why. Juliette listened carefully and wrote everything down. She didn't judge. She didn't explain. She just collected stories. As the weeks passed, Juliette realized that the river had touched many lives. People didn't talk about it because they didn't understand it. They thought it was stress or imagination or something they should ignore. But Juliette believed it was real. She believed the lanterns carried more than light. They carried emotion. They carried memory. And the river passed it on to those who were open enough to feel it. She decided to create a space where these stories could be shared. She spoke to the director of the local museum and asked for a small room to host an exhibition. She called it Lanterns of Memory. She decorated the room with soft fabrics, drawings of rivers, and handmade paper lanterns. Each lantern had a tag where visitors could write a message, a dream, or a feeling they wanted to release. Juliette invited people to come and share. Some brought letters they had never sent. Others brought objects that reminded them of someone they had lost. A few simply came to listen. The room filled slowly, day by day, with quiet voices and gentle stories. People cried. People smiled. People felt less alone. Juliette didn't try to explain the magic. She didn't need to. She let the river speak through the stories. She let the lanterns carry the weight. She became a guide, not a teacher. She helped people see that memory could move, that pain could travel, and that healing could begin in silence. The exhibition lasted for a month. During that time, Juliette saw Valmont change. People began to talk more openly. They asked questions. They visited the river and watched the water with new eyes. Some even made their own lanterns and released them, not as part of a tradition, but as a personal act of letting go. Juliette felt proud, but also humbled. She had started with a dream, a feeling she couldn't explain. Now she had helped others find their own stories. She had shown that the river was more than water. It was a thread between souls. It connected people who had never met. It carried emotions from one heart to another. She continued to collect stories, even after the exhibition ended. She kept them in a notebook, each one written with care. She didn't know what she would do with them yet, but she knew they mattered. They were proof that something invisible could still be real. And as spring turned to summer, Juliette walked by the river each evening. She watched the light on the water. She listened to the quiet. She felt the wave of change moving through her city, gentle and strong. And she knew that the lanterns would return next year, carrying new secrets, new hopes, and new connections. Chapter 7. The Father's Secret. Théo Lambert sat by the window in his small house in Saint-Luce. The river outside moved slowly, just like his thoughts. Since meeting Juliette, something inside him had changed. He no longer felt alone with his secret. Her quiet understanding had opened a door in his heart. Now, he wanted to know more. He wanted to understand the part of his life that had always been missing. That evening, Théo spoke to his mother. Her name was Camille, and she had always been gentle but guarded. She loved Théo deeply, but she rarely spoke about the past. When Théo asked about his father, she looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded and sat down beside him. She told him the truth. His father's name was Luc Moreau. He had been a painter who lived in Valmont many years ago. He was quiet, creative, and full of dreams. Camille had met him during a summer visit to the city. They had spent a few months together, sharing long walks and soft conversations. But Luc had never known she was pregnant. Before she could tell him, he had died in a sudden accident. Camille had returned to Saint-Luce and raised Théo alone. Théo listened carefully. He didn't feel angry. He felt sad, but also curious. He wanted to know who Luc had been. He wanted to see the world through his father's eyes. Camille gave him a small envelope. Inside were a few photographs and a note Luc had once written to her. The handwriting was soft and flowing, like brushstrokes on paper. The next day, Théo traveled to Valmont. It was his first time visiting the city. He walked through the streets slowly, looking at the buildings, the river, the people. Everything felt new, but also strangely familiar. He asked around and found a small gallery that had once displayed Luc's work. The owner remembered him and showed Théo a few paintings that had been kept in storage. Théo stood in front of the paintings for a long time. They were full of color and emotion. One showed the river at sunset, glowing with soft light. Another showed a woman walking through a field of wildflowers. Théo felt something stir inside him. He saw pieces of himself in the brushstrokes. He saw the quiet strength, the gentle sadness, the love for beauty. He asked if he could buy one of the paintings. The owner smiled and gave it to him as a gift. Théo carried it back to Saint-Luce, holding it close. That night, he made a new lantern. This time, he didn't place a secret inside. He placed a thank you note. He wrote simple words. Thank you for the colors. Thank you for the silence. I see you now. He walked to the river and released the lantern. It floated gently, glowing in the dark. Théo didn't cry. He didn't feel lost. He felt connected. He felt that part of his life had always been nearby, waiting to be found. The river carried the lantern downstream, just like it had carried the first one. But this time, the message was different. It was not pain. It was peace. It was not a question. It was an answer. Théo stood by the water until the lantern disappeared. Then he turned and walked home, feeling lighter. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he knew who he was. He was the son of a painter. He was a boy who had learned to let go. And he was ready to begin again. Chapter 8. Resolution. Juliette Morin sat at her desk in the library, surrounded by notebooks, letters, and sketches of lanterns. The room was quiet, filled with soft light from the afternoon sun. Her hands moved slowly across the page as she wrote the final chapter of her book. It was not just a story about a tradition. It was a story about connection, about memory, and about how silence could speak louder than words. Since her meeting with Théo, Juliette's life had taken a new shape. She no longer felt like a woman waiting for something to change. She had become part of something larger, something that moved through water and time. Her dreams had become messages. Her questions had become bridges. And her quiet nature had become a gift. She had stayed in touch with Théo. They wrote letters to each other, simple and honest. Sometimes he sent her drawings of the river or small paintings inspired by his father's work. Juliette replied with pages from her book, thoughts about the lanterns, and stories collected from people in Valmont. Their friendship was gentle, like the river itself, steady, calm, and full of meaning. Théo had entered art school in the city. He lived in a small apartment near the museum and spent his days painting, studying, and walking by the river. He often visited the gallery that had once held his father's work. He learned to mix colors with emotion, to draw light with memory. His art was quiet but powerful. It spoke of longing, of hope, and of the beauty found in letting go. Back in Valmont, Juliette's exhibition had inspired others. People began to release lanterns not just in Saint-Luce, but in Valmont too. They gathered by the river each spring, bringing their own messages, their own stories. Some wrote letters to lost loved ones. Others released regrets they had carried for years. The lanterns floated together, glowing softly as they moved downstream. Juliette watched them each year, standing by the water with a notebook in her hand. She didn't collect the lanterns. She didn't try to read every message. She simply observed, knowing that each light carried something important. She believed the river knew where to take them. She believed that someone, somewhere, would be ready to listen. Her book, titled Lanterns on the River *, was published quietly. It didn't become famous, but it found its readers. People who had felt strange dreams, quiet sadness, or unexplained memories wrote to her. They thanked her for giving voice to something they had never understood. Juliette replied to each letter with care. She knew that every story mattered. The river between Saint-Luce and Valmont was no longer just part of the landscape. It had become a path between hearts. It carried more than water. It carried emotion, memory, and the invisible threads that connected people. The tradition continued, but now it was deeper. Now it was shared. Théo returned to Saint-Luce each spring. He walked by the river, visited his mother, and released a lantern of his own. Sometimes he wrote a message. Sometimes he simply let the light speak for him. He didn't feel the same pain as before. He felt peace. He felt gratitude. He felt part of something that would continue long after him. Juliette grew older, but her spirit stayed light. She kept writing, kept listening, and kept walking by the river. She believed that what we let go does not vanish. It moves. It finds its way. It becomes part of someone else's story. And so, the lanterns floated on. Year after year. Light after light. Message after message. They drifted through the quiet water, carrying secrets, regrets, and hopes. And those who were ready to understand received them, not with fear, but with open hearts. Moral: sometimes what we let go doesn't vanish. It finds its way to those who are ready to understand. Secrets and regrets can become bridges if we allow them to be heard. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.